One of the very important fruits of Hellenistic Judaism was the Septuagint, one of the first major translation projects of the scriptures from their original language into another language, in this case Greek. Ashland Seminary, in its Bible Museum, actually has a very small memento of the artifact known as the Septuagint. We have a very small fragment, about the size of a business card, of Exodus translated into Greek. This particular manuscript is probably a mid-4th century manuscript written on papyrus from Egypt. It's part of a larger codex. Here we see a fuller spread of 2 pages, still both partial, of the original codex, which might just have contained Exodus, or might have been part of a thicker bound volume of part of the Pentateuch. The fragments themselves in this particular manuscript are not in a great state of repair, but they remain an important witness to the ongoing life of a Greek translation of the Old Testament, in this case, the early church. This is probably a Christian, a manuscript produced by Christians in Egypt rather than by the Jewish community. One of the things that is especially prominent in Christian manuscripts of both Testaments is the use of what we call nomina sacra, holy names, really just a system of abbreviations. This is an extension of Jewish usage. As you might know, in Hebrew manuscripts, there are only abbreviations of the divine name, the name of God, the unpronounceable and unwritable name. And that was the first nomen sacrum. Instead of writing out Yahweh, we would find the letters with the vowels to Adonai. And in some cases, even more strict abbreviations. I believe just 2 yods, one after the other, as a kind of abbreviation for the divine name. Well, there was a radical expansion of this in Christian practice for the words for God, Christ, Spirit, a human being, Israel, and some others that are escaping me at the moment. In this particular manuscript, for example, you could find the abbreviation for Israel here as the first letter, iota, and the last 2 letters of that proper name in effect. And on the second half of the slide, you see a theta and a sigma, which looks more like a C in this manuscript than the typical sigma, with a line over it. That's the first and last letter of theos. One of the features of these abbreviations is that you could still tell what case the original name is in. Theos is the nominative case, meaning God is probably here the subject of a sentence. In this previous slide, theou, you find theta with an upsilon, signifying the name God in the genitive case, probably using the word God to describe another word or to indicate possession. Well, what then is the origin of this practice? How does it come about that Christians are reading Exodus, which was composed in Hebrew, in Greek? And what significance is there to the fact that both early Jews and early Christians are reading their scriptures, the Jewish scriptures, the Old Testament, in Greek rather than in the original language? How did we even get a Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible by the turn of the era, so that it was available for the early church from its very beginnings? When did this Greek translation come about? Why? Well, the why is actually the easiest. Jews lived in communities separated from Palestine for hundreds of years before the turn of the era. The Jewish community in Babylon, of course, got started at least by 597 BC, when Nebuchadnezzar first conquered Jerusalem, and certainly after 587 BC with his far more invasive deportations of Jews from Jerusalem. The Jewish community in Egypt dates back to about the same period, at the very least, when some Jews sought refuge from Babylon by leaving their native land and going into Egypt, which was not under Babylonian control. Well, after centuries of living in, say, Alexandria in Egypt, or other, especially Western diaspora sites like Antioch or Cyprus, Jews became alienated from their own native language. They took on Greek for most of their practice, most of their business, most of their everyday interactions, and Hebrew became less and less a part of their lives, to the point that large segments of the Jewish population found themselves alienated from their very scriptures, unable to understand them, based on Hebrew, or even an Aramaic targum, or paraphrase translation. So at least by the time of Ptolemy II, about 246 BC, we have evidence of the 5 books of Moses having been translated from Hebrew into Greek for the use of the Jewish communities in the major centers of diaspora in Egypt, very quickly becoming useful to Jewish communities elsewhere as well, wherever Hebrew was forgotten. It's quite likely that the prophets were not translated quite as early, but we could surmise by about 200 BC, since we start seeing quotations of the prophets in Greek, and perhaps even some manuscripts. I'm not sure about that. Even the prophets were translated by then, with the Psalms and other writings following suit soon after. We don't actually know how the translation took place, but we do find some interesting stories about this act of translation in Hellenistic Jewish texts. The least legendary appears in the letter of Aristeas. Aristeas is a pseudonym. Aristeas writes to Philocrates, and both characters, Aristeas and Philocrates, are Gentiles, are Greeks living in Egypt. And Aristeas is part of an envoy sent by the Egyptian king, Ptolemy II, to the high priest Eleazar. And the legend is, and this part is seemingly based in reality, Ptolemy II wanted to stock the library of Alexandria as fully as possible. He was a great patron of letters and culture and knowledge, and so perhaps at this time he indeed wanted also to have the sacred books of the Judean people, people under his rule by that point, by 246 BC, in his library. So how are you going to do this? You send a delegation to the high priest to get the best copies of the original possible, and get skilled translators to make it available in Greek, because of course no one in Alexandria is going to learn Hebrew in order to read these ancient books. So according to this legend, 72 translators, 72 scribes, are sent by the high priest to Alexandria in order to provide Ptolemy with the best, most authoritative translation possible. There's a lengthy passage in which these translators demonstrate their wisdom, their fitness for the task, by discoursing with the king and answering his questions about philosophy and politics and all manner of topics that show their erudition, their excellent training. And then they produce a translation after they are feted by the king in the 7-day banquet. They go to work in a very secluded, private place and produce a translation that, when it is read to the Alexandrian Jews, is acclaimed by them as, in every respect, accurate, with the community even pronouncing a curse upon anyone who changed this new Greek text, either on purpose or by accident. Again, we don't know the historicity of this story, but it does at least speak to the high authority and the high value placed upon the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, at least, the books of Moses at the very least, by the Hellenistic Jewish community at the time that the letter of Aristeas is composed, which tends to fall somewhere in the 1st century BC. A greater, or shall I say, a more impressive legend about the birth of the Septuagint is found in Philo's Life of Moses, in which, well, let's just read the text itself. These translators, I think they're down to 70 now, which gives us, by the way, the name of this translation. Septuaginta is the Greek word for 70. The translators proceeded in their task, quoting now, like men inspired, prophesied, not one saying one thing and another, but every one of them employed the self-same nouns and verbs, as if some unseen prompter has suggested all their language to them. In this legend, the 70 translators work separately from one another, each trying to produce the whole in Greek. And the miracle of the translation is that all 70 scholars working independently come up word for word with exactly the same translation, which proves then divine inspiration in the act of translation. Getting 2 scholars to agree is miracle enough, let alone 70. So Philo explains the miraculous nature of this by talking about the difficulty of translation, which is worth keeping in mind for us as we deal with our scriptures based in English translations instead of the original. So Philo writes, "Every language, and the Greek language above all others, is rich in a variety of words, and that it is possible to vary a sentence and to paraphrase the same idea so as to set it forth in a great variety of manners, adapting many different forms of expression to it at different times. But in the case of this translation of the law, in every case, exactly corresponding Greek words were employed to translate literally the appropriate Hebrew words." Thus Philo praises the translators as not mere interpreters, but inspired speakers and prophets, to whose honest and guileless minds was given the leadership of the most pure spirit of Moses. Again, a legend, and far more legendary, far more miraculous even than what we find in the letter of Aristeas, which now by comparison seems quite reasonable and modest. One thing, though, that emerges from Philo's discourse that is particularly important for us is this concept, known to the ancients, that translations could be undertaken differently, that 2 people working to bring Hebrew into Greek could come up with something different. And the fact of the matter is that those who used the Greek translation of the Hebrew Scriptures often noticed and admitted that there were differences between the Greek translation and the original. It was evident that something happened in the act of translation that introduced some distance between the original and what people were using as their scriptures. Thus, for example, in about 132 BC, we find this testimony about the Septuagint. This comes from the prologue to the Greek translation of a Hebrew wisdom book, the Wisdom of Ben Sira. Now, Ben Sira was a scribe who led a school in Jerusalem, approximately between 200 and 175 BC. And he left his curriculum essentially in writing for posterity, at least 51 chapters of his collected wisdom. And his grandson translated this from Hebrew into Greek for the benefit of Jews living in Egypt. In his prologue to this translation, the grandson apologizes for any shortcomings in his translation, and he explains that, quoting now, what was originally expressed in Hebrew does not exactly have the same sense when translated into another language. Even the law itself, the prophecies, and the rest of the books, here referring to the scriptures in their three-part division, differ not a little when read in the original. So here in 132 BC, a testimony to awareness of the fact that the Greek translation is somewhat different from the Hebrew original in some respects. One of the ways in which translation shifts meaning has to do simply with the resonances of particular words. Thus, in the original Hebrew scriptures, you would encounter a word like tzedek, the Hebrew word for righteousness, often particularly in terms of alignment with the stipulations of the covenant of Moses. Tzedek is often translated in the Septuagint as dikaiosune, which is the Greek word for justice. Now, there's, of course, a lot of overlap between these two concepts, but dikaiosune was a major ethical term in Greek. Aristotle, I think, spends 2 books of his Nicomachean Ethics talking about dikaiosune, about justice, in how to act justly in various kinds of relationships. Philosophers, ethicists are very interested in what dikaiosune means, and as soon as then you bring the scriptures into Greek and you start reading now about dikaiosune in the law of Moses or in the prophets or in what the psalmist praises, we're not likely merely to hear this term in the same way that you would have heard tzedek living in the context of Judea. Now the psalmists and Moses, the law of Moses, are speaking within and to the larger Greek conversations about the virtue of justice and what it is and how does one enact justice in human relationships, in families, in friendships, in patron-client relationships, toward the gods, toward the state, and what have you. So the meaning itself potentially is informed now by the larger Greek conversations about this, one of the 4 major virtues in the Greek world after Plato. And also, the Jewish scriptures enter that conversation as a dialogue partner, and really even the focal point of the conversation is shifted from how do I keep the Mosaic covenant, which is distinctive to my people, to how does this text contribute to an understanding of dikaiosune, of justice, in a larger sense. Similarly with the Hebrew word emet, which generally means reliability, faithfulness, that on which you can count or rely. This tends to get translated in Greek as pistis, which also means faithfulness, reliability, but includes now concepts that emet does not, namely faith, belief. So there's a bit of a shift then from the text, which in Hebrew refers mainly to an ethical quality of the person, to the Greek text, the Greek translation of the same, where now you could begin to put more emphasis on the activity of the mind, believing, formulating conceptions, accepting propositions. Thus, having faith not just in the sense of trusting the reliability of someone else, but holding to particular beliefs. Chesed, another noteworthy example, in Hebrew, chesed, often translated loving kindness, actually tends to mean covenant loyalty. Chesed is a very important word within the framework of keeping covenant, such that loving the Lord is really keeping faith with the covenant one has made with the Lord, acting faithfully in regards to these obligations. Chesed is often translated into Greek as eleos in the Septuagint. And of course, eleos, which means mercy or compassion, is now a word that is fairly well divorced from the context of a particularistic covenant. So it becomes possible, for example, when reading Hosea 6:6, to come to a very different conclusion about what God wants from human beings. In the Hebrew, we would read, I desire chesed and not sacrifice, meaning, I want you to keep my laws, not mess up and therefore have to offer sacrifices for it. I want you to live faithfully by the covenant and demonstrate your loyalty to me by virtue of your diligent walking in the covenant, rather than bringing scads o animals as sin offerings, which are merely a testimony then to your negligence of the covenant. But when this is translated into Greek, and we read it in the Septuagint, we read, I desire eleos and not sacrifice. I desire compassion. I desire mercy and not sacrifice. So suddenly there's a great broadening of what God might want. And mercy and compassion do not necessarily have to be enacted only within the context of the Mosaic covenant, that body of laws that keeps Jews separate from other Jews. So this could be a major shift in how some Hellenistic Jews read Hosea. I should also point out that cultural context matters a lot and affects how the translation proceeds. So, for example, in the Psalms, rock is a favored metaphor to describe God, because a rock is solid. A rock is that which does not shift. It gives you an anchorage, a reliable mooring in the world, a place of security and stability. This is all fine and well in Judea. But when you move into a diaspora context, all around you are gods made out of rocks, stone, marble, limestone, what have you. And one of the ways in which Jews take issue with or criticize their Gentile neighbors is to speak of them as worshipping sticks and stones, gods made out of rock or metal or wood that cannot see or hear or speak or walk or deliver themselves or anything, but these lifeless masses. So it becomes a little bit more awkward to say of the one God, the God that you believe is the only God, that he is a rock, when you're trying to distinguish your faith from the faith of all your neighbors. Hence, it gets translated as, blessed be my God. And the metaphor is thrown away because of the problematic nature of the context. There are some even more significant shifts in translation, which might reflect changes in ideology between the context of the original composition, say of the text Amos 9 back in the pre-exilic period, and the ideology of the time of the translation into Greek, round about the mid-third to early 2nd centuries BCE. So in the Masoretic text, the Hebrew text of Amos 9, we read, on that day, the day of God's intervention, I will raise up the booth of David that has fallen. I will repair its breaches and raise up its ruins and rebuild it, as in the days of old, in order that they may possess the remnants of Edom, and all the nations who are called by my name. So there is the hope here in Amos 9 that the Davidic monarchy will be restored, And the result of this restoration will be the reconquest of the territories lost to the south and to the west, particularly the coastlands. So all the nations who are basically squatting in the land called by God's name, all those areas will be reconquered under the renewed Davidic dynasty. This comes out very differently then in the Septuagint, the Greek translation. I've adapted here the New Revised Standard Version to reflect now very closely the differences between the Greek and the Hebrew originals. On that day I will raise up the booth of David that has fallen, and repair its fallen parts, and raise up its ruins, and rebuild it as in the days of the age. So far not very different. In order that the rest of humankind, and all the nations over whom my name is invoked, may seek it out. Now the second half here is remarkably different, because now we're not talking about possession of neighboring non-Jewish areas and perhaps the reconquest of the original territory allotted to the 12 tribes. Here we're talking about the results of restoring Israel in terms of how the nations take notice and are drawn to Israel and the God of Israel as a result. There is the elimination of any sense of conquest or repossession. Instead, this is a more peaceful vision of how the nations, how the Gentiles will come to honor and glorify Israel and presumably Israel's God because of what Israel's God has done on Israel's behalf. As we turn then to the New Testament, it's very important for us to bear in mind when any New Testament writer is quoting an Old Testament text that author may be relying on the Hebrew text and rendering it in Greek, or maybe relying on the Septuagint text tradition, which is already in Greek, or of course maybe relying on some other tradition or quoting from memory in a way that differs from every known tradition. So we want to be sensitive to the fact that that New Testament uses of the Old Testament have some steps of mediation in them about which we should be aware, the most important of which is the older translation of the Old Testament from Hebrew into Greek, which we have been calling the Septuagint. Take Paul, for example, who quotes the Old Testament about 100 times, give or take. Of those times, there is really no meaningful difference between Paul's quotation, the Hebrew text that we know, and the Septuagint text, the Greek text that we know, about 4 out of 10 times, 40 out of 100 times. Paul agrees with the Masoretic text against the Septuagint, as we know them, only 7 times. But Paul agrees with the Septuagint against the Hebrew text 16 times. So in those instances, there may be something in the Septuagint, in the Greek translation, that is nurturing Paul's argument or helping him make his point that is actually different from or perhaps even contrary to what we find in the Hebrew Bible and therefore in the Old Testament of English translations, because all of our English translations rely on the Hebrew text, not the Septuagint. Paul is something of a maverick when it comes to quotations. He actually disagrees with both the Hebrew and the Greek text traditions 3 out of 10 times, 31 out of 100 times. He's quoting from memory or he's paraphrasing, but we've all done that, so we can't fault him. If we go back to Hosea 6:6 and this difference between I desire chesed and I desire eleos, in the setting of Jesus, of course, Jesus may himself well be quoting the Hebrew text back to his opponents, or at least a very close Aramaic translation of the Hebrew. In his context, the meaning is probably not different from Hosea's. What God wants is for you to keep covenant, not fail to keep covenant and rely on the sacrificial system to somehow keep getting forgiveness for stuff that you have no intention of doing. Jesus was really quite radical in terms of calling for greater obedience to the law of Moses than even the letter of the law, but expanding the application of the law of Moses radically, calling for heart, mind, body, in every way to be living out God's law. But to the Greek reader of Matthew or Mark, I think it's in Mark also, this saying might really conjure up different meanings. So Christians reading Mark anywhere in the diaspora, hearing "I desire eleos and not sacrifice," could hear this in terms of ethical action, the response of kindness, generosity, of taking care of those in need as the things that really matter most to God, as opposed to the sacrificial systems of the Torah. But notice then the sacrificial systems of the Torah are no longer being replaced with obedience to the stipulations of Torah, but obedience to this larger norm which either Jewish Christian or Gentile Christian could equally well fulfill, taking care of the person in need, showing compassion on those who are hungry or thirsty or in prison or in pain or sick or whatever their need might be. So this might very well feed into that broadening of the Christian community beyond the bounds of ethnic Israel. If you look at Amos 9:11, that text about either possessing the remnants of Edom or the rest of humankind and all the nations seeking out Israel, we see that Acts, the author of Acts, is much more sympathetic to the Septuagint translation than the Hebrew text, than the Masoretic text was. Acts quotes Amos thus: "After this I will return, and I will rebuild the dwelling of David, which has fallen. From its ruins I will rebuild it, and I will set it up, so that all other peoples may seek the Lord, even all the Gentiles or all the nations over whom my name has been called." Now, clearly relying on the Septuagint version as opposed to the Hebrew version, because we're talking about humankind and the nations seeking out something because of what God has done for the booth of David. Now the author of Acts specifies that these nations will not seek Israel out. This will not ultimately be to the glorification of Israel, but will seek out the Lord. It will be the glorification of God, what is happening in Israel. And this, of course, then very well suits the Christian mission that the author of Acts is speaking about, using Amos 9:11. The building up of the dwelling of David is the restoration of the people in Judea, Samaria, and Galilee around the prophet like Moses, around the heir of David, around Jesus and faith in Jesus the Messiah. And as this dwelling is erected amongst Jewish Christians, Gentile Christians then are invited to seek out the Lord, and they too are called by God's name. So this becomes a major legitimation of the law-free Gentile mission. Another example comes from Psalm 40, which is, again, somewhat different between the original Hebrew and the Septuagint translation. And we'll see that the author of Hebrews makes greater use of the Septuagint version of the psalm because that version is amenable to the theological point the author of Hebrews wishes to make. In the Hebrew we read, Sacrifice and offering you do not desire, but you have given me an open ear, or more literally, ears you have dug for me. Burnt offering and sin offering you have not required. Then I said, Here I am. In the scroll of the book it is written of me, I delight to do your will, O my God. Your law is within my heart. This is translated into Greek in the Septuagint before the turn of the era thus: Sacrifice and offering you did not desire, but a body you have prepared for me. You did not ask for whole burnt offerings or sin offerings. Then I said, Behold, I am here. In the scroll of the book it is written about me, I desired to do your will, O God, according to your law, in the midst of my belly. Now those two texts are not very different, but notice that the metaphor of digging out ears has been abandoned in translation. So instead of you have dug out ears for me, the translator writes, a body you have prepared for me. Perhaps finding the metaphor as kind of ugly as you might, thinking about murine and earwax and who knows what else. So we have a somewhat sanitized translation, the meaning of which is the same. You don't want sacrifice and offerings, you want obedience. So you've given me a body, and this body I will use to do what your law says, as opposed to ignore what your law says and then offer bunches of sacrifices hoping that will be good enough to make up for it, when what you really want is heart obedience. The author of Hebrews comes upon the Greek version of this and sees here a legitimation of the kind of sacrifice that we find on the cross, that put on the lips of Jesus, this psalm finds its meaning. Sacrifices and offerings you have not desired, but a body you have prepared for me. In burnt offerings and sin offerings you have taken no pleasure. Then I said, See, God, I have come to do your will. Here, really now, the body becomes another kind of sacrifice, as opposed to a vehicle for doing the law of Moses. And this is almost a climactic moment in the author of Hebrews' presentation of Jesus as not only the high priest, but also the better sacrifice that affects the cleansing of the conscience that animal sacrifices which were offered year after year never could. So again, in this way, the Septuagint provides an early Christian author with a resource, a valuable theological resource, that the Hebrew original did not. So if you happen to go to the Bible Museum at Ashland's main campus and see this little fragment, what does this little fragment teach us to remember? A few major points. First, Greek-speaking Jews from 250 BCE on, and therefore many early Christians who were themselves Greek-speaking, read the Greek translation of the Jewish scriptures as their Bible, not the original Hebrew, not an Aramaic Targum. Second, the Greek translation, the Old Greek, commonly called the Septuagint, differed in some significant ways from the original Hebrew. First, because translation choices caused old connotations and resonances to be lost, while at the same time bringing the sacred text into new contact with Greek and Roman ethics and the like. Also because the translation sometimes represents important developments in interpretation of the original for a new context and a new ideological situation. The third point would be that despite these differences, Greek-speaking Jews and Greek-speaking Christians often affirmed this translation as equally authoritative and inspired as the Hebrew text tradition. And fourth, early Christian biblical interpretation, starting with the New Testament authors themselves, often took the Greek translation as its starting point, and sometimes discovered interpretative possibilities thereby that would not have been possible on the basis of the original Hebrew. Or to sum it all up another way, the Old Testament in your English Bible which is another translation from the Hebrew text, is not precisely the Old Testament of some major sectors of the early church. It represents a translation of one such tradition, but we would do well to purchase an English translation also of the Septuagint to keep on hand when reading the New Testament and thinking about the use of the Old Testament and the New, because that Greek translation of the Old Testament was probably more used in the early church than the Hebrew text, even in the first century, and then increasingly thereafter in the second and third centuries, which were highly formative for the Christian church and Christian theology. There is a very good choice for this now. The New English translation of the Septuagint, published by Oxford University Press. I think the list price is $30, often available for less on Amazon. And you can also find this available online for free. It's not downloadable, but it is available to be read online. If you just Google New English Translation of the Septuagint, you should come to that site as well. Thank you for your attention. I hope this has been a helpful introduction to the complexity of what the Old Testament looked like at the time that the early church was being born.